Welcome, everyone. It's office hours. I'm Professor Zelizer of the Longview, Julian Zelizer, and pleasure to be with you this week, holiday week. I hope all of you have nice plans for the various holidays you're celebrating. Hanukkah just came to an end, and also the new year is ahead, 2026, and I know many people are eager to start that new year after what many feel is a very difficult and fraught political year. Anyway, this is office hours, and I'll let people join where I take questions and comments from everyone in the chat, and happy to try to address as many as possible. I don't have a foreign policy article this week. I'm taking a few weeks off from the column, and I will restart in mid-January. I will have my Longview newsletter coming out tomorrow morning, dealing with the theme of conservative populism. And some of you sent really nice notes last week. I wrote, hi, Esther. I wrote a piece for the Longview on the renamed Kennedy Center, Trump Kennedy Center. And basically, I just provided something of a brief history of where that center came from and what its goals were. And I'm happy to discuss that further today if people are interested in how it was named after the deceased president and the intention of creating a living memorial, and obviously the implications of the board voting, even though it is a congressional privilege to do this, to rename it the Trump Kennedy Center, which I believe is already on the front, and on many levels. I think why people feel that so to be so problematic, including the very origins of this institution and what it symbolized in the late 1950s and early 1960s when it was created. So happy to talk a little bit more, and maybe I'll start with that. And please send in your questions, and I will jot them down and I can get to them. So the Kennedy Center, it really originates in 1958 under President Eisenhower. And the goal of creating an arts and culture center was to really highlight, in part, that Washington, D.C. had become a cosmopolitan modern city, that it was now not just a place where politics took place, but really was developing into a premier city. The second is this is the Cold War, and there was a belief, very alive and well in the 1950s and 1960s, that federal investment in culture and the arts was, in fact, part of the effort to make the United States triumphant, to really highlight one of its great assets against communism. And so the idea starts to percolate in 1958. And then President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, who, of course, is inaugurated in January of 1961, he and his wife are very big believers in this mission and this aspect of American life. And Kennedy plays a role in launching in 1962 fundraising for a center in Washington, and private fundraising initially. And there's a huge event. I have a clip on the newsletter. You can take a look where the former President Eisenhower, in fact, speaks in favor of this. And there's a lot of bipartisan support. Obviously, President Kennedy is tragically assassinated in November of 1963, so doesn't see this come to fruition. It's an idea. And Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, who is his successor, quickly moves forward on making the center a reality, and proposes legislation that he sends to Congress, which will provide federal funding for a center of the arts, and renames it the Kennedy Center as a living memorial for the president who was slain and who very much believed in the arts and culture and the role of the government in supporting that. And again, as I go through some of this, please feel free to send in some questions and comments so I have something I can talk to all of you about. That's on your minds. So please do that. And so the center legislation moves through with bipartisan support, and the whole idea is millions are provided in federal funds, and they will be matching private donations. And the legislation moves through Congress. December of 1964, Lyndon Johnson is there to break ground. There's a whole backstory on where the center was actually put into place physically, controversies over that, but there's an architect. And the building takes place. It won't actually finish until 1971, but that's when we have the John F. Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And since 1971, it's really emerged as intended as a showcase of great culture and great arts located in our nation's capital, symbolizing that part of this country is devoted to that artistic element of human life as essential. And so I think a lot of the backlash that happened, and again, it's of all the issues, I think many people probably on this list don't rank this as the top concern about the administration. There's obviously the shooting of the boats, there's federal deportation, and much, much more cuts to the social safety net. But I think it's a little like the East Wing. It just symbolizes for many people so much, both in terms of his desire to have this renamed. It was done by a board that has been essentially remade to be packed with Trump loyalists. It also, I think, and this is part of what my point was in the article, it's not simply about what you think of President Trump's own sense of self, but it's also coming as his administration is working in very aggressive fashion to really hurt all the kinds of arts that the Kennedy Center has embodied a commitment to. Slashing federal grants since January of 2025, putting immense pressure, as we are seeing now, certainly on historical museums, about what kind of content is acceptable and what is not, but that extends to the arts. And obviously putting pressure on media organizations. We talk a lot here about the news, and that, though, can also extend. Thank you, Don. It can also extend to it can extend to what else is being programmed. And there's a long history of controversy over different kinds of programming, and I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see more rumblings about that. I mean, the horrible, horrible passing of Rob Reiner, which is also just a story that I think many of us are trying to come to grips to, is also a reminder of the show he was on at first as an actor, All in the Family, which was incredibly kind of controversial and pointed in many directions of how it treated the different divisions in 1970s America. And I don't know today if that kind of cultural content would be put out as easily. We're seeing at CBS. There's a story today you can look up about a piece that was clipped from 60 Minutes. And the pressure, I think, that is now being felt will affect the arts as well, including on television. Soap, the show some of you might remember, introduced one of the first gay characters in national television, played by Billy Crystal, and look, so on and so on. I'm not going to get in the history of TV, although I'm happy to if anyone's interested. But I imagine some of the controversy we are seeing with commercial corporate media and news, and yes, Don, this is an international story. Even the BBC is feeling this and feeling it from the United States and President Trump. But you're seeing also this kind of pressure in many autocratic autocratic areas as well. And so I think culture will feel it beyond the news. And I think that's the next conversation. We did see it with Jimmy Kimmel, but I'm talking about other kinds of artistic content. And so all of this to come at a time when he renames the center that meant so much, and also obviously in terms of a president assassinated. So censorship and the First Amendment, which has been a front and center issue since January of 2025, continues to be, I think, an area there's going to need to be a lot of pushback, if not the forces moving in this direction, which are part political censorship, part corporate caution, which can be very devastating when the incentives are wrong, are putting us in a difficult situation. Sorry, I missed some of the questions. I wasn't jotting them down. A second area that I saw someone mention again, and we've been talking about this, is the continued tensions with Venezuela and that interview with Susie Wiles, which is still pretty fascinating, exposed, which many people suspect that this is not about drug trafficking. It's very much about putting pressure on Venezuela, but it gets back to how is this done? And if that is the case and the justification is not what President Trump has said, and even if the justification was that, I think there's many legal experts who say that shooting boats without due process, without clear rationale, is possibly a military crime, a war crime. But now, if it's not even about that justification, that's huge implications for presidential power. There's an article, by the way, in the Times by Peter Baker, who, as you know, who was on the Long View a little while back, about kind of the imperial presidency that we're seeing. And part of the article, which I've often stressed, is this is many decades where, as Don is saying, Congress has relinquished a lot of authority. We've allowed the executive branch to grow dramatically, and President Trump is exploiting that. And as with everything, part of that is the story of the backdrop and the foundations. Part of it is the places President Trump is willing to take it in ways that even previous presidents in both parties with executive power as an apparatus were not. And I think as 2025 ends, there is a reckoning about what this all means and what it means broadly, historically. We're about to hit the 250th anniversary of our constitutional separation of powers. What happens when the country, and I think Congress certainly is to blame in many ways, the courts are to blame, and voters are to blame, when we have allowed the executive branch to expand so much. And when other institutions that do have power to check that executive branch are not acting and often are facilitating that power, where are we in terms of the original founding ideas of this country? What has the country done to a system that was premised on the need to achieve constant, perpetual restraint on institutions and the people who hold them? I think when it comes to the executive branch, as this year comes to a close, there are very, very serious, legitimate questions about how far we have moved from that vision. Again, historically, this is not the first time. This is part of a longer trajectory. We've been talking about the imperial presidency, certainly since the early 70s, since 1973, when the historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote the book about that. And there were reforms, but here we are again. Elizabeth, where is Congress? One of my main arguments is, I think, right now, at least, we need to talk about a Republican Congress, not just Congress. And I think the Republican majority is not simply stepping back. It's a very good question. It's facilitating this. And I think there's a partisan dimension of all of this where the Republican majority sees Trump as an asset. There is an also important and equally a good question about whether some of the challenges, splits, and fissures that are emerging in the MAGA Republican Party can ultimately undercut that. I don't discount that, and I'm happy to talk more, and I'm sure we'll be talking more in weeks to come about how serious these problems become. Low approval ratings, open splits in MAGA Republican world, many Republicans kind of abandoning ship, many female Republicans, which is an interesting dimension of the party. And if again, I think the heart of this is not some moral reckoning from the Republican Party. But I think more important is, frankly, the partisan reckoning. And that's what is the key. When does the partisan calculation for the GOP become not to stand by the president as opposed to standing by it? I think that's kind of what people are looking for. Or when does the congressional Republican majority lose its power? And that very well could be in November. I don't think that's unrealistic at all, given everything we've seen in the last few months. I think Elizabeth raises a good point. I mean, the question is, where do checks come from, at least in the short term, if the partisan unity holds temporarily? Congress will not take big steps to challenge the president. If the courts are endorsing an expansive view of executive power, Elizabeth asks, can world leaders do some of this kind of work? There's obviously limits. I mean, world leaders do not have the capacity. The leader of France, the leader of England, does not have the capacity to get into constitutional and procedural mechanisms within the United States, but they have pressure. I mean, the U.S., as powerful as it is economically, is part of a global economy where, as we're seeing with tariffs and the chaos about that, there's lots of pressure points. We no longer produce all the goods that are essential. Taiwan, for example, is very instrumental to computer chips in a way that President Biden was trying to reverse, but now a lot of that has not succeeded and is being undercut. So world leaders certainly have economic leverage. The U.S., as powerful it is militarily, still depends on international alliances. They have that kind of leverage. If the United States wants support, they want certain initiatives. This is another pressure point. But again, I think the real kind of power comes from Congress, from the courts, and ultimately from voters. But I think that's good. I think let's see who was just commenting. Robert, that's a question, and I don't have an answer. You go through these moments in American history where there are splits within party, and it's hard to tell, are they serious or not. So, for example, in 1948 is a period where Democrats are facing pretty serious splits. And I think of 1948 because this is the year Hubert Humphrey, who's then a Senate candidate, makes this for Minnesota, makes a speech in Philadelphia at the Democratic National Convention, and he calls on Southerners in his party to essentially, or he calls on the party to stop listening to Southerners who talk about states' rights. And Humphrey says it's time for the Democrats to kind of move out into being the party of human rights. And they're talking about civil rights legislation and a plank that they want in the platform. And it causes a split. It's a great book about this by my friend and colleague Sam Friedman that just came out last year. It's excellent about Hubert Humphrey and the speech. And it causes rifts. Some Dixiecrats form a third party, the Dixiecrat Party, and run a candidate, Strom Thurmond. And there's a lot of kind of concern, will the party split apart? Ultimately, it doesn't at that time. The Southern-Northern alliance within the party, which caused a lot of friction. Southern conservatives who controlled the committees, who didn't support civil rights, et cetera. And the party doesn't fall apart, but it is actually, and this is interesting, Robert, and time moves differently and the political context moves differently. It's the part of a rift that will keep opening and become greater and greater, exploding in the 1960s and 70s to the point where ultimately Southern Democrats leave the party. Are we in anything like that now? Party unity is much stronger for many reasons, and we can talk more about this. But we're not talking about the kinds of divisions that were on the table in the 40s and 50s for the Democrats, because again, as I keep saying, I know I sound like a broken record. This is an era of very narrow majorities. And because of polarization, you're talking about numbers at the margins that are needed. So small cracks, as you saw with the discharge petition, for example, in the House, are sufficient to actually cause big problems. So we need to think of difference and uh, coalitional fracture differently in 2025/2026 than we did in the 1940s. So we will see. And it's the same is true for presidential elections. It's no longer an era of 1964s and 1972s and 1984s. We're talking about electoral college swings, which are contingent on very narrow shifts. Let me take a break as I get to the final questions. Thank you again, all subscribers, to tuning in, especially on a holiday week where I know many of you are gearing up for your celebrations. Thank you for all your support, paid subscribers in particular. Thank you. This has been a great year. This is the year the Longview launched, and the paid subscriptions have allowed this not only to continue, but I think to expand and flourish. I hope you feel that way with new features and lots of interviews. And this week, and some of you asked, will I be doing it? We do have interviews. I'm going to be interviewing today, actually live at I think 1 o'clock Eastern. Sorry, I always forget to have my schedule, but you'll see it come out. Zach Walz is running for the Democratic nomination to run for the Senate seat for Iowa. He will be joining me live on Friday. I will have Jonathan Alter and I will be doing that. And now Michael Cohen of Truth and Consequences, not the former Trump ally, but a journalist who many of you I know like. We'll be talking a little bit about the state of politics. And I'm going to have a book interview also on Friday. Matthew Pinsker, who teaches at Gettysburg and wrote a terrific book called Boss Lincoln, which looks at Abraham Lincoln as a real, fierce and skillful partisan and how he helped build the new Republican Party. I think you'll enjoy it. I just read the book by Norton, and I really found it fascinating. A whole different side to Abraham Lincoln with lessons very relevant today as Democrats gear up for the next election. And that I saw a comment maybe by Richard, but I'm sorry, whoever said the DNC is clearly also another important voice. And I do think the DNC is that they don't have the power as Congress does to create checks and limitations. But the DNC does have very phenomenal power, A, in agenda setting, and B, obviously, in setting up the consequential elections that are ahead, 2026 and 2028, which actually fit the billing of the historical significance that people are accorded. And so you will see where the DNC lies. These are two very different kinds of elections. One is an election, I think, a mandate on President Trump. The second, 2028, will be a mandate on what the Democrats have to offer. But right now, the heart of this is going to be candidate recruitment. This is what parties should be doing. In this year's off-year elections, I think the parties performed actually much better than many thought. So we will see how it takes shape. But that point is very important. And just to conclude, back to the 1950s and 60s, the DNC was actually quite important in reimagining the Democratic Party, creating a party under people like Paul Butler, who was one of the heads of the DNC that was more united, that was more ideologically committed to liberalism, and was more willing to start taking aggressive stands internally against conservative elements of the party that were rooted in the South on issues such as race and healthcare. So excellent point, and a lot of historic kind of backing to that. Thanks everyone for joining me. I hope you can tune in for all the interviews. this week. For those who can't, I hope you have a great Christmas celebration. And my newsletter will be out tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.